Good morning from Tokyo. My name is Agnes Suri, and I'm the Deputy Head of the Capacity Building and Training Department of the Asian Development Bank Institute, ADBI. Welcome to the first episode of the new ADBI Webinar Series entitled The Economics of Climate Change, How to Climate-Proof Economies and Public Finance. Climate change is threatening development as the number and intensity of extreme weather events are increasing rapidly everywhere. In parallel, climate change mitigation and adaptation policies and the development of climate-friendly technology can lead to a rise in transition risks, which are extremely difficult for countries to manage. These dynamics adversely affect economies and public finances through diverse transmission channels. Moreover, countries have a range of financial instruments and economic tools such as fiscal policies, budgeting, debt, financial regulatory frameworks, among others. And these instruments play an important role in promoting climate adaptation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and supporting more sustainable and resilient growth. This series will focus on the climate-related transmission channels, which affect economies and public finance, as well as the economic and financial tools available to policymakers to address the climate emergency. It will include one-hour episode per month. And with this new knowledge product, we hope to improve general understanding of the economic and financial aspects of climate change. We hope to recommend economic and financial solutions useful for policymakers to build resilient and low-carbon economies. And we hope to strengthen developing countries' capacities to design climate strategies and align this with national budget, processes, and investment plans. The first episode of the series will focus on promoting climate change adaptation with fiscal policies. Without further ado, let me invite the ADB Institute CEO, Dean Sonobe, to welcome you and introduce the theme of this first episode. Dean Sonobe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Agnes. Good morning from Tokyo. I'm delighted to open the first episode of this new ADBI series of webinars, which will gather a lot of knowledge on climate change solutions. Global average temperatures are already exceeding 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. If the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, are aggregated over all countries, the estimation result would suggest that we are on the path toward 2.4 to 2.6 degrees rise by the end of the century. Since climate will continue to change, even if mitigation actions are implemented at scale, the adaptation to climate change is critically important. I have just used the term adaptation to refer to economic and social adjustments to the current and future effects of climate change. The latest UNEP's Adaptation Gap Report 2023, published just this month, emphasizes that progress on adaptation is slowing across all three aspects, namely finance, planning, and implementation, when adaptation should be rapidly accelerating. Adaptation finance in developing countries needs to be 10 to 18 times as great as current international public adaptation finance laws. Fiscal policies are a powerful instrument to support adaptation. Fiscal policies include government spending and taxation. Government spending can directly prioritize public investment in adaptation programs. Taxation can also be designed to incentivize key stakeholders to make the right choice supporting adaptation. We are curious about what wise fiscal policies are and what challenges policymakers are facing in implementing such policies. This 1-hour webinar will offer excellent examples and the experience of a country highly vulnerable to climate change to satisfy our curiosity. So I wish you a great session. Agnes, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dean Sonobe. Now, I'm very happy to introduce our panelists. Let me start with Bruno Carrasco. All the bios are available on our event page, but let me highlight the following. Bruno, you are the Director General of the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department at the Asian Development Bank, which has recently positioned itself as the climate bank in Asia and the Pacific. You are also originally an expert in governance, public sector management, and an economist. Today, taking the perspective of multilateral development banks, you will share your insights on lesser-known solutions and instruments as fiscal policies can do more than just promoting public investment. Bruno, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Agnes. Thank you also, Dean Sonobe, for your continuous leadership. It's always a pleasure to work with you and your ADBI team. A big thanks, of course, to Sanju Bak, Agnes Suri, and my colleagues at the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department, Yolanda Fernanda Floman and Declan McGee. Their contributions have really supported this idea, bringing in more discussions around the economics of climate change. ADB is delighted to be part of the seminar series, and I'm honored to be speaking in the first episode. I have a lot of interest and passion in the subject, and I'll try to keep to my 10-minute allocation. As Dean Sonobe has said, with increasing greenhouse gas emissions and net zero targets still some ways away in most countries, the expectation is that we will continue to see increasing temperature rises over the decades. You will recall at COP26, Alok Sharma's reference to the weak pulse of keeping temperatures within 1.5 degrees Celsius. Such trends again suggest that even with the important mitigation actions and recognizing hard-to-abate sectors, countries will need to strengthen their efforts to both support mitigation and other measures. Usually, when we talk about adaptation, we're looking at large-scale infrastructure changes, such as building defenses to protect sea level rises, building seawalls, and such sorts of things. This largely falls on government expenditure. You will recall, and I'm glad to see Emmanuel here, the IMF had a very important publication on quality infrastructure a couple of years back. And again, the idea here is that while building this infrastructure could be costly initially, it represents higher value for money over the lifespan as it prolongs the life of these assets. Now, the reality, turning to the fiscal side, is that there's an increasing reality that fiscal headroom is limited, and of course, fiscal needs are rising. So on the first front, we recognize that many of our economies are fiscally constrained, particularly following the strong countercyclical programs adopted by countries following the COVID-19 pandemic. Developing member countries in Asia, more generally, are facing other challenges, including larger debt to GDP ratios that have increased steadily. There is now an increasing trend towards higher interest rates in response to the inflationary pressures that is raising borrowing costs across most economies. And something that we've discussed on numerous occasions in the Asian Development Bank, developing Asia's tax to GDP ratios are low, and they are consistently hovering around 15% in terms of tax to GDP ratios, compared to OECD averages of about 25%. We have, as many of you know, an Asia-Pacific tax hub program in place that seeks to try to raise greater efforts in terms of tax revenues across our developing member countries. Now, the second point is that fiscal needs are indeed rising, and we're seeing that climate-induced natural disasters are largely wreaking havoc on much of the infrastructure assets across the region, if they are not protected. And estimates point to losses from natural disasters, including climate-induced natural disasters, of about $400 billion over the period 2015 to 2022 across Asia Pacific and affecting approximately 800 million people. Capital investment requirements, therefore, are large and rising, and with it associated expenditures on operation and maintenance. This, of course, calls for closer attention to fiscal space management. And here, I would like to focus on the importance that to create fiscal space, we cannot look at the climate challenge simply as an add-on to fiscal policy. If we do that, we will never get to a situation where we are able to build the necessary infrastructure, climating it as we require. I think that we need to bear in mind three things to embed climate change into fiscal policies. And this comes from a report that we will soon be publishing on climate resilience fiscal planning. And those three key items would be, number one, improving the assessment of fiscal risks. The second one would be strengthening the management of the fiscal risks. And thirdly, optimizing resource allocations and investments. So just touching briefly on each and one of them. On the fiscal risk assessment, it largely involves identifying, assessing, and disclosing the impact of climate and disaster risk on fiscal sustainability. And here we look at particularly four impacts: the macroeconomic shocks, the implicit, explicit liabilities, the adaptation needs, and of course, the public services provision and the requirements of that. We do recognize that some countries are moving ahead quite nicely in terms of being able to better assess these fiscal risks. And we recognize that in the case of the Philippines, it publishes an annual fiscal risk statement that includes a section on the impact of climate disasters and refers to the ongoing funding and management initiatives to address these impacts. Turning to the second one, fiscal risk management, we recognize that fiscal policy can be used to improve risk management. And also we need to recognize that it is important to ensure targeted investments to better manage climate and disaster-related fiscal risks. So we need to increasingly classify the fiscal outlook across different buckets, if you will, associated to different degrees of risk. And here we will need to look at such things as clear identification of risk assignments, so who is responsible for what type of risk, better risk management, including approaches to manage risk, ensuring risk avoidance, preparedness, risk reduction, risk transfer, and risk retention. And then, of course, targeted investments. So governments can use, of course, fiscal policy to incentivize investments in climate action. Several countries have started to integrate these climate risks into their public investment management systems. And here we want to recognize Armenia as one example where they have issued guidance on assessing such things as exposure of projects to climate risk and the extent to which projects contribute to emission reduction on climate resilience. The third item is optimizing resources to better able to finance and invest, recognizing the limited fiscal space. Here we see many countries, many finance agencies looking at how they can support fiscal policy to improve domestic resource mobilization, as I mentioned earlier, and ensure that there is enough private finance to complement public finance for investment in climate action. Here we could talk about such things as improvements in domestic resource mobilization. One of the things that we're looking at is in terms of resilience at the community level, looking at property taxes as a way to generate more own revenue. But we can also look at things such as climate responsive taxes and tariffs. And here we can talk about carbon tax to generate more revenue, support investment in low carbon activities. And of course, the budget reallocation process, and in particular, looking at how we can reduce a lot of the subsidies into the fossil fuels. We've got examples such as India, where they were successful in removing diesel subsidies. We need to look at that more and more, and I know that most of the MDBs are having a strong involvement in that work. In addition, we need to look at innovative ways to support fiscal space, including such things as pricing of carbon, developing more and more sovereign green resilient bonds, debt for climate as well as debt for nature instruments that some parts of the world are looking at more actively. And finally, special purpose vehicles to mobilize pools of funds for multiple resources. Lastly, before I conclude, a very important element is the link between the fiscal risks from climate and the financial risks. So large are very much exposed in different ways to climate risk. And rating agencies are starting to recognize that some economies are more prepared than others. So shadow credit ratings, including how countries are recognizing the climate exposures, in addition to the more traditional macro fundamentals approach to sovereign ratings, will be a very important signaling effect and thereby create the necessary incentives to take this work more seriously. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Indeed, the perspective you just shared to promote this comprehensive action from the production of fiscal revenues to how these resources are spent is very important. Indeed, assessing, for example, the fiscal risks is critical to then optimize the fiscal space available to policymakers so that they can act meaningfully. Now, moving to our second panelist, I'm delighted to welcome Emanuele Massetti, who is a senior economist at the Climate Policy Division of the Fiscal Affairs Department at the International Monetary Fund. Emanuele, before joining the IMF in 2021, you were an academic at the School of Public Policy of the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta and at the Yale School of the Environment. Emanuele, while we have focused on specific solutions, let's now take a step back. As adaptation solutions vary across countries, what are the key economic principles that can guide policymakers in the integration of climate change adaptation into fiscal policies from your perspective? Emanuele, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organizers for having me here today, and greetings from Washington, where it's late evening at this time. I'm going to share my screen I'm going to use just a few slides to help you to follow my remarks here. 1 second. Can you see my slide?
Yes, very well.
Perfect. So again, thank you very much. I'm a senior economist in a newly formed division at the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, the Climate Policy Division, and this tells you something about how serious the IMF is on climate change. We are very serious about helping our member countries to prepare for climate change, and we heard today that unfortunately there's not much we can do. Climate will continue changing for several decades, even if the most stringent targets, the Paris targets, are successful. So there's no question that all countries have to adapt. And one of our first tasks in our climate policy division was to establish solid principles for integrating adaptation to climate change into fiscal policy. We summarize these principles in 3 staff climate notes, and I will use this opportunity to illustrate just some important messages. But these notes are available from our website, and I hope you will use this chance to have a look at what we are doing in this area and read them in their entirety. So I want to start by saying that if we don't have a shared definition of adaptation to climate change, it will be very difficult to discuss policies to integrate adaptation into fiscal policy. So let me start with this simple question: what is adaptation to climate change? It's a very simple question, but trust me, it's very important that we have a shared answer to this question. Now, we can try to answer this question with what the IPC says. Climate change adaptation is the process needed to minimize losses and maximize benefits from climate change. This sounds obvious. I want to stress here the importance that we would not be doing climate change adaptation without climate change. So climate change is the reason why we do adaptation. And it will become now clear why I'm saying this. But to make this even more explicit, in our staff climate notes, we stress the importance of the additionality principle. Investment needs in climate change adaptation can be defined as the difference between optimal investment levels with and without climate change. So this means that adaptation includes projects that are only implemented because of climate change, like barriers against sea level rise, and the additional cost due to climate change for projects that would be approved anyway, like the cost of reinforcing roads against the incremental risk of flooding due to climate change. Adaptation to climate change does not include, instead, the cost of closing the gap to achieve an optimal level of adaptation to historical climate. For example, the cost of reinforcing roads against historical floods risks that have been previously neglected due to poor planning. Yeah. Or adaptation does not include investment in economic development that would reduce vulnerability against future climate change, but would be beneficial even without climate change. For example, continuing with the example of road building, the full cost of a new road would not count as an adaptation to climate change, while the cost of reinforcing the road will be an adaptation to climate change. This distinction is important. Is important when we try to include a cost adaptation with a cost for adaptation in our budget planning, because otherwise we end up conflating development and adaptation. Development and adaptation are strongly connected, but they're two very distinct. They're also very distinct. They're connected, but not the same. Now, I want to illustrate two important facts with these two panels that you see on these slides. First, on the left panel, you can see here the emerging and low-income countries are in general more exposed to climate risks than advanced countries. This means that while adaptation to climate change is important for all countries, it is particularly needed in emerging and developing ones. Second, higher incomes are associated with higher adaptive capacity, as shown in panel B. Evidence shows that development reduces climate vulnerability, and reducing climate vulnerability facilitates economic development. That's where adaptation and development are strongly connected. Then this means that the goal of governments is to promote the best mix of investments towards adaptation and other development goals to promote the virtuous cycle of climate resilient, sustainable economic growth. An unbalanced approach in which adaptation to climate change subtracts resources from investment in development, or investments in development does not consider climate risk, will not be socially optimal. Now, for this reason, with limited resources, and this is really important because we don't live in a world with unlimited resources, we have budgets. Mm-hmm. Well, all countries would benefit if adaptation to climate change were holistically integrated into countries' development plans. We have to think about adaptation as another dimension of long-term development. Now, with these principles in mind, when we acknowledge that countries face many competing needs in promoting sustainable development, a first task is to establish when government intervention is warranted. And here we identify three important areas. The first is investment or subsidies for adaptations that have positive externalities, or adaptations that are public goods. Why? Because markets will underinvest in these adaptations. So this is a key area for government intervention. Some examples: information about climate change, early warning systems, research and development in technologies that help countries to adapt, like new seeds that are drought and heat tolerant, and infrastructure, updating public infrastructure. Second, normal market failures. The normal market failures that we all know lead to inefficient private investment in all development projects, including adaptation to climate change. Adaptation here is not different from other development projects. Now, removing these barriers will stimulate development and private adaptation. Some examples are imperfections in credit markets that don't allow poor farmers to invest in, for example, new technologies or new tools that are essential for adaptation, or barriers to trade that do not allow capital and other inputs of production to move where they are more productive. And finally, inefficiencies in insurance markets that are key to efficiently price risks so that markets can promote an efficient amount of risk in all dimensions. And finally, only governments can implement redistribution policies to deal with equity issues that arise from climate change or from adaptation policy itself. Now, once areas of interventions have been defined, we argue that cost-benefit analysis principles and methods can be applied to adaptation programs as to any other development program. Now, the distributional impacts can be critical and should be first estimated and then assessed by the government as part of the cost-benefit analysis. Of course, we're perfectly aware of all the limitations of cost-benefit analysis. Sometimes we don't have data, there are uncertain benefits, long-run horizon for many development projects, adaptation projects. However, we argue that cost-benefit analysis can still play an important role in helping decision makers to maximize the impact of their spending, while balancing efficiency and equity according to society's preferences and risk aversion. We don't have to forget that we have these fundamental trade-offs that can be very important. As an example, I want here to make to consider the case of adaptation against sea level rise. This is clearly not needed without climate change. We wouldn't be building barriers against sea level rise without climate change, so it perfectly satisfies the additionality criterion. These protections can be very expensive and can subtract resources to normal development activities. So we have to be very careful about how we plan against sea level rise. Now, as an alternative to protecting extensive areas, coastal areas, we can think about planned retreat, where over time, capital is we leave capital depreciate. The areas are progressively abandoned to minimize losses. Well, this turns out to be one of the cheapest long-term responses to coastal to sea level rise. However, planned retreat can be problematic. While in the case of protection, the costs are shared by all taxpayers, in the case of retreat, losses will be concentrated among those that leave or own capital along the coastline. Now, compensations can be economically efficient, but they may be politically unfeasible. Now, we don't have a perfect recipe here, but cost-benefit analysis can help governments to assess the cost and benefits of different protection strategies, and can assess also them to assess efficiency equity trade-offs in a systematic way. Now, I want to conclude with 4 important considerations that summarize our work. Climate is changing and will continue to change, even with intensive mitigation efforts. This is clear. I started working in this area at a time during which most people didn't want to talk about adaptation to climate change because there was a fear that if we were talking about adaptation to climate change, we would not do mitigation. But now everyone has realized that, unfortunately, we have to deal with the consequences of climate change. Second, all countries need to adapt to climate change and would benefit if adaptation were holistically integrated into countries' development plans. This requires mainstreaming adaptation into governments' budgets. Governments can focus their actions on adaptations that are public goods, on reforms that remove barriers to efficient private adaptation, and on dealing with equity impacts of climate change and adaptation. Now, finally, I want to stress here something, maybe it's not necessary, but there is a lot of evidence that adaptation can greatly reduce the negative effects of climate change. However, adaptation cannot replace mitigation. Adaptation and mitigation are both needed to help reduce damages from climate change. Without strong mitigation, it will not be possible to stabilize global temperature, and adaptation would become either impossible or too expensive. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Emanuele, for insisting on this last point. And you are right. All countries need to adapt, and their benefits will be the highest if adaptation is holistically integrated into countries' development plans. This point was also highlighted by Bruno when he explained that it cannot be treated simply as a simple add-on. In addition, in your intervention, you highlighted that public intervention will have the strongest value for investment with positive externalities. Removing barriers to efficient private adaptation is also very important. And I personally really appreciated also the focus on the importance of redistribution in your quick presentation. As the poor are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So clearly, the policymakers need to keep this in mind. Now we have covered some specific solutions and discussed key principles to consider in order to implement smart fiscal policies supporting climate adaptation. Let me welcome our third panelist to look at an insightful country case study. Our third panelist is Maria Lualati Dorotan Chuseko, also known as Undersecretary Alu, from the Philippines, one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. Undersecretary Alu, you are the Department of Finance spokesperson and you are handling the Climate Finance Policy Group, among others. One of your responsibilities is to be the Sherpa and representative of the Philippines to the Coalition of the Finance Minister for Climate Action and Vulnerable 20 V20 Group of Finance Ministers. Undersecretary Alu, how are fiscal policies used to promote climate adaptation in your country? The floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm very honored to share this webinar with such prestigious panelists. And I will have to send my dad a photo with everyone because it's an honor to be here. And I was just taking notes. I must have missed some of the aspects, and I would really love to review what you've imparted and just tick off the boxes in the Philippine experience. And if we haven't done it yet, then we have to start conversation on those aspects. But without much further ado, I think I'm asked to join the panel to just, tell our friends and everyone how we're faring here in the Philippines. So again, I'd like to thank my fellow speakers for sharing their insights and investing their time on today's webinar. As mentioned, the Philippines accounts for only 0.3% of the global carbon emissions, but as an archipelago sitting at the juncture of the Pacific Ring of Fire and the Typhoon Belt, we are one of the world's most vulnerable countries to the effects of the climate change and other external shocks. For the past decade, the Philippines has incurred losses and damages estimated to reach over $10 billion for the climate-related hazards. Clearly, we are more than determined to take all necessary measures to climate-proof the Philippine economy. And that is precisely what we have been doing through game-changing legislation, green fiscal policies, and a slew of other sustainable initiatives. It is my privilege to share with you two key areas, specifically on fiscal policies, and show you how the government is spending on adaptation and resilience to climate change. Recognizing the critical role of the private sector in steering climate action, the Department of Finance continues to promote a fiscal incentive regime that rewards innovation and prioritizes climate-related investments through the Strategic Investment Priority Plan and the Corporate Recovery Incentives for Enterprises, or the CREATE law. Just roughly under our strategic investment plan, exporters get a 5 to 10 years income tax holiday and additional 10 years of enhanced deductions or special income tax rate of probably 5%. And for domestic enterprises, they get 5 to 10 years income tax holiday, and of course the 5 years of income enhanced deductions. And these activities would include those establishment that foster or establish creating green environment and forming resilient industrial and agricultural sectors. To complement these, the department is now proposing the enactment of various environmental tax measures that can promote innovation, sustainability, and adoption of green technology at an ambitious scale. These include rationalization of the mining fiscal regime, the imposition of a tax on single-use plastics, a motor vehicles users charge on all types of vehicles, and a carbon tax. We are also studying, and after this, we are proceeding to a meeting with a technical working group with the World Bank on the carbon pricing instruments. We are pursuing that. We feel that carbon taxation and pursuing carbon markets is not mutually exclusive of each other. On the planning side, we are working with partners such as British government and the ADB to detail our national adaptation plans and NDC. In 2022, the Philippines launched its first ever sustainable finance roadmap to encourage sustainable investments in green projects and infrastructure. The roadmap and its guiding principles laid out the enabling environment and policy signals to support the Philippines' just transition into low carbon and climate resilient economy. To complement the roadmap, we are developing the sustainable finance taxonomy guidelines to classify whether an economic activity is environmentally or socially sustainable. Once in operation, the guidelines may serve as a guide. Hold on. Once in operation, the guidelines may serve as a guide for a variety of users, including companies, investors, financial institutions, regulators, and consumers, to help them make informed decisions on investment, finance, purchase, or monitor an asset. And also, this will complement the amendments that was recently passed on the private-public partnerships, just to make it easier for private sectors to invest by streamlining the processes and codifying all rules on PPP. For government spending, we have the People Survivor Fund of PSF, the National Budget Allocations for Climate Adaptation and Resilience, and finally, Disaster Risk and Insurance. So I would just like to go over this quickly. The Philippine government's People Survival Fund is a special fund dedicated to climate adaptation as institutionalized through a law. The PSF is managed by a multi-sectoral board and is allocated to improve the capacity of local government units or subnational entities to respond to the impacts brought about by climate change. It provides LGUs, or the local government units, and community organizations access to funding to augment their resources to implement climate change adaptation projects. The fund has an initial allocation of 1 billion pesos, or 18 million US dollars. We are proud to share that the PSF has recently marked a milestone moment in its 11-year history with approval of over 9,700 US dollars, or 539 million pesos worth of climate adaptation projects. With this was just in on October 23. We approved over 5 projects on adaptation belonging to various local government units, including provinces and 5th-class municipalities. With this, the utilization rate of PSF is now at 89%, or 15 million US dollars. And of course, my personal agenda as the alternate member of the board, alternate chairman of the board, is to have the fund replenished. This week, we are going to have a ceremonial turnover of funds with the President of the Philippines, and we invited all the beneficiary local governments. I have, candidly, I'm gonna say it I'm amongst friends. I have two agenda. Number one is to show the president that the president and the world, when we go to COP28, that we can mobilize domestic climate finance. And we can do it on our own. And not on our own, but we can do and provide solutions in our shores. And number two, I would want to request the president to replenish the the fund because it's almost used up. So I'm hoping that another billion will be allocated for the next year for that. And also, it's also a good time to tell our development partners that there is a provision under the law which allows us to receive donations, grants, and endowments. And that's one of the agendas that I would push forth in the next year to make that operational. In the 11 history of the fund, it has never been operational. We're thinking that maybe we could course through GCF or other grants through the People Survivor Fund. Just quickly on the how we select projects, it's really, we look at the level of risk and vulnerability to climate change, participation of affected communities in the design of the project. We so believe that it has to be a partnership between the national government and the subnational. So if we feel that it's the project will fall squarely into the hands of the national government, we don't put much point on that because we want a partnership, a collaboration. And another criteria is we look at the poverty index in the area because we want the project to be a poverty reduction potential, to have that potential. And of course, the cost effectiveness and attainability of the proposal, the identification of potential code benefits extending beyond the LGU territory, and maximization of multi-sectoral or cross-sectoral benefits, responsiveness to gender differentiated vulnerabilities, and availability of the climate change adaptation action plan. Of course, that's number one. We have to see that the local governments have that in place. Moving on to the national budget allotment, the Philippine government also allocates a fund for the national risk reduction and management. This covers aid, relief, rehabilitation services to communities or areas affected by human-induced and natural disasters. The Philippine Catastrophe Bond, or CAT Bond, aims to provide insurance coverage in times of earthquakes, tropical cyclones. This is about 75 million, 250 million US dollars. When Typhoon Odette, or the international name is Typhoon Rai, hit the Philippines in 2021, the wind speed reached the partial trigger for the CAT Bond. This resulted in a 52.5 million US dollars payout for the government. The Philippines has also issued its first batch of sustainability ESG global bonds and sustainability samurai bonds to finance or refinance assets in line with the country's sustainable finance framework. From March 2022 to early 2023, the country has already issued a total of $3.6 billion worth of sovereign funds under the framework. To supplement these items in the national budget, the government, through the DOF, has also secured contingent credit lines with bilateral and multilateral development partners. These credit lines function as a standby loan facility for which may be disbursed in the form of general budgetary support after the declaration of a state of calamity of public health emergency. Lastly, under the Philippine Disaster Risk Financing and Insurance Strategy, we also utilize risk transfer mechanisms such as insurance for climate resilience. An example is a city-level parametric liquidity program, formerly known as the Philippine City Disaster Insurance Pool. This is currently being developed with the TA assistance from the ADB. The pilot design includes 10 cities across the Philippines. Meanwhile, the Philippine Catastrophe Insurance Facility is currently being developed. Last year, the guidelines on the adaptation of revised schedule of minimum catastrophe rates were issued. The guidelines provide for the revised schedule of minimum catastrophe rates prescribed to be observed by all life insurance companies, and intermediaries for insurance policies covering earthquake, typhoon, and flood risks. In closing, my friends, these programs and initiatives are proof that fiscal policy must be front and center in climate adaptation. We look forward to hearing and learning from all of you as we create a vital and underlying conditions for making climate resiliency through fiscal instruments and public funds continue to be responsive, relevant, and catalytic to the needs of the Philippines. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing such a comprehensive strategy, which includes adaptation and mitigation as the sides of the same coin as highlighted by Emanuele a bit before. I'm sure other policymakers attending the webinar or watching it will definitely learn from your ongoing action for climate. So thanks for sharing it. We have now a few minutes left for our panel discussion. Let me now turn back to Bruno. Bruno, in your first intervention, you shared with us very interesting points. And it's great to see ADB is very active on this front. You mentioned a new instrument, the debt from nature swaps. Could you share a little bit more information about it? Who is leading the development of this instrument amongst the multilateral development banks? And are there any good examples of where this kind of instrument has mobilized or freed up funds for adaptation?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question, Agnes. Before I answer, let me just very, very briefly say how delighted we are with the work that the Philippines is doing in terms of the climate response, climate change response. We have been working very closely with DNR Secretary Tony. So Undersecretary Alu, thank you so much for mentioning these points. We've had the first climate change policy-based loan to the Philippines. We're working on a follow-up on that. We had the technical assistance projects that Undersecretary Alu mentioned, including Advanced NDC, working also with the National Adaptation Plans. And to your point, Undersecretary Alu, we also have a community resilience partnership facility that's looking at helping communities help in terms of infrastructure adaptation projects. So I think this speaks a lot to the work that you're also doing with local government units in the Philippines. Agnes, turning to your question, yes, we are in discussions with the Inter-American Development Bank, the Nature Conservancy, and others in terms of what are some of the nature-based solutions that have, in some ways, a fiscal dimension. So we certainly are looking at initiatives such as what happened recently in Barbados, where there was a debt for nature conversion. I understand that this was linked to a $150 million sustainability linked loan that resulted in about 30% of marine areas around Barbados to become protected, as well as generating $50 million in conservation savings for grants and endowments that help to capitalize investment in natural capital. Similarly, we are aware other countries, including in Ecuador, where there has been a debt for nature conversion, again, a slightly larger amount, $656 million of sustainability-linked loan, and this helped to support effective management of some 60,000 square kilometers of marine reserve in the Galapagos area, as well as generating $459 million in conservation savings. So as you can see, there are a lot of potentials of integrating fiscal debt conversion measures with the idea of sustaining and promoting nature. So those are just some examples. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bruno. Indeed, a huge potential for Asia and the Pacific. Now turning to Undersecretary Alu. Undersecretary Alu, you shared with us your comprehensive strategy, and you candidly also shared with us your hope after the COP28. Could you share with us a specific challenge you faced to implement climate adaptation solution through fiscal policies, and explain how you overcame it? This is really to share your experience with the policy makers who are also online with us.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because I think that really is it hits home, because although you have all these ideas, solutions in your head, when you implement, really, really hard. The first one is really on the financing part. It really is, I think that we still have to develop climate tagging. It's how do you say this, in reporting, which ones will be adaptation projects, which one can be financed under the UNFCCC. So it's really tagging, and we are hoping to address that with the development of the taxonomy. With the taxonomy, sustainable taxonomy, we will be able to say which are the green areas of investments, right? And we can further, because going to COPE, we will be really advocating that, to do away with loans. If we can't do grants, at least we zero in on investments. And that is really complementing our national policy that we would want more investments on green investments in the Philippines. So, but right now, we're very, very fortunate that the president has prioritized, rollout of adaptation projects, and looking at how to green the economy. So that's one on the climate tagging. I think we're working on that. And number two, it's another one is on capacity building. For instance, for the domestic climate finance, we really have a problem on how the local government or subnational governments can come up with a bankable project proposal. It's so now we instead of just giving adaptation project funding, we are now giving project development grants, just to align all the proposals with acceptable, translating their vision, or their adaptation vision into bankable projects, and something that grants can actually fund. And another one, and Mr. Carrasco pointed on this, is that the focus on the big infrastructure. All the funds right now are focused on infrastructure, on energy. But 90% of the Philippine economy is actually the small, medium enterprises. So now we are developing together with the Department of Trade and Industry on how to capacitate them to transform the activities into climate adaptation projects. Because it's not just about the big infrastructure, the energy, the agriculture, but we have to also take care of and take a look at the small, medium enterprises. So those are the biggest challenges, I think. And also, again, at the center is the capacity building on these enterprises.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary Alu. Indeed, in ADBI, we are currently thinking about how to improve our capacity building offer to target local governments who are indeed critical players in this agenda. So thanks for sharing this. Now turning to Emanuele. Emanuele, we believe it's useful for policymakers to understand how the IMF can support them in implementing the adaptation agenda. The IMF has now a new tool, it's Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which helps countries with limited room in their budget address long-term challenges, including climate change. How is this instrument concretely used to support adaptation in countries?
Well, yes. So this is a relatively new facility that the fund has put in place, and it's available to our member countries that qualify. The idea is first kind of obvious, but it of course increases fiscal space. It allows countries to make investments that they would otherwise not be able to afford. And it's not just climate change, as you mentioned. It's resilience and sustainability. So it's promoting this idea of holistic development that I was stressing during my presentation. Adaptation to climate change is an important component. But for example, we help countries to implement reform measures to increase efficient water use. That is going to be useful with climate change, but it's part of it's a key part of a sustainable development strategy. In practice, countries have access to additional resources. They commit to implement reform measures, and here is also where we help to countries to implement these reform measures, including important steps to integrate climate risks in their macro fiscal planning. I've been part of two missions, one in Rwanda and one recently in Jamaica. They were part of this package of reform measures that the countries committed to do for within the RSF. And what we did is to work with local authorities to look at ways to include climate shocks and long-run climate change into their macro fiscal planning. We went with a tool that allows countries to practically see what are the fiscal implications of climate change, so that they can start making provisions for additional costs. And this starts a discussion, this starts a process where local authorities, people in the Ministry of Finances, technical experts start thinking about this long-term process that is adaptation to climate change. So we are just not helping countries to do concrete things, but we're also helping them to set up the institutions, the procedures, the frameworks that they will need for essentially the rest of the century to cope with the risks that they will face due to climate change. But again, not only climate change, also other potential risks from including pandemics and other challenges to normal operations.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing this. Indeed, the institutional aspects, processes are critical in responding to the climate emergency. Thank you. So it's now time to close this first episode. And while the COP28 is about to start, I want to sincerely thank our panelists for sharing their knowledge as well as their experiences to better understand how fiscal policies and associated tools are critical to build climate resilience. Let me just highlight some key points we heard during this first webinar. There are several tools such as ex-ante fiscal risk assessment, climate budgeting, fiscal regime that rewards innovation and prioritize climate-related investments, debt swap, debt for nature swap, subsidies, catastrophe bonds, and contingent financing. PPPs as well were quoted. And these are critical to mainstream adaptation into country strategic development planning, select the best solutions, and unlock the right behaviors. The second point I wanted to make is that fiscal policies can do much more than financing regular public investments, supporting adaptation. And today we covered several useful examples. Being selective is important, and selecting the best actions with large externalities can be done with systematic cost-benefit analysis. Redistribution policies are also key, as poor and vulnerable people are suffering from climate change the most. I would like also to highlight one final point, which is that targeted financing, such as the People's Survival Fund in the Philippines, highlighted by Undersecretary Alu, is also a powerful tool to mainstream adaptation from national government to local government units. And this, I believe, will build resilience at all levels of the economy and the society. So this is also very important. Thank you for joining episode 1 of the ADBI Webinar Series on the economics of climate change. The recording will be uploaded to the event webpage shortly. And if you haven't already done so, please register for episode 2, which will be held on the 7th of December. Please also take a few moments to complete our post-event survey. Have a wonderful day, and we look forward to welcoming you at the following episodes and future ADBI events. See you in December. Thank you.